Alrighty, so I promised to examine RFK Jr.'s chances in the Democratic primary in 2024 now that he is officially a candidate. He has filed paperwork to run for president. He is the first candidate since old Teddy, the lion of the Senate, in 1980. Teddy Kennedy also ran against a sitting Democratic president. In that case, it was Jimmy Carter, and he did not fare well. There's an infamous question, infamous interview, or was it during a debate maybe, where a journo completely destroyed Teddy Kennedy. That's how you know you're a bad candidate, when you're a Democrat and you get destroyed by a journalist. And they asked him, I think it was a woman, I think she said, so Senator Kennedy, why do you want to be president? And he couldn't come up with an answer. He didn't really have a reason why, you know, he thought he'd be a better president than Jimmy Carter, which, come on, should that really be that difficult of a leap to say, hey, I'm going to be better than Jimmy Carter? But he didn't have an answer. And, you know, people always like to boil down campaigns to one question and say, you know, hey, what's his name in 1988, governor of Massachusetts, ran against George H.W. Bush. He lost the day that he was asked, you know, hey, do you believe in the death penalty for someone who rapes and murders your wife? And he said no. And every man in America and every woman in America said, I'm not voting for that guy. People like to boil things down to moments like that. Moments like when George H.W. Bush was checking his watch during a debate, and it looked like he didn't want to be there, you know, and then he went on to lose that whole election. These are moments that, in hindsight, people go back, you know, and find them and say, oh, that's why this guy lost. When, in reality, you can probably find such moments for anyone, whether they win or lose. It's just when they lose, people like to go back and say, this is the moment he lost. Like the Howard Dean scream. Oh my gosh, the scream heard around the world that destroyed Howard Dean's campaign. Which I just found very endearing. Howard Dean was losing anyway. That's why he screamed like that. He was having a nervous breakdown. But anyway, total tangent. This really didn't have anything to do with RFK Jr., considering he has not made that kind of a blunder yet that people could, you know, ascribe to his impending loss. No, what will be RFK Jr.'s undoing, if it is not an assassination attempt that either kills him or incapacitates him? Please see the campaign of Robert F. Kennedy Sr. for president and how that ended for more on that topic. What will be his undoing, potentially, is the actual schedule of the Democratic primary elections. In other words, there is a chance, there's a decent chance right now, that RFK Jr. just plain loses in a Democratic primary. After all, he's not the kind of Democrat that really has a lot in common with the average Democratic voter that you know. At least not the ones who are really politically engaged. You know, the kinds who, you know, talk about politics a lot on, you know, Facebook or Instagram or, God forbid, Twitter. Trump-obsessed wine moms like Politics Girl are never going to vote for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in a primary. And so RFK's path to a Democratic nomination is trying to tap into the base of supporters who at first flocked to Bernie Sanders, who then were abandoned by Bernie Sanders as he triangulated and decided to play ball with the Democratic Party and sell his soul, I guess, for a book deal. RFK Jr. is going to be butting heads with the Democratic establishment, and so he needs a pool of voters in these early primary states who likewise do not support the Democratic establishment. And what do you know? The Democratic Party has decided to change their schedule of their primary elections. For the first time in my lifetime, booting Iowa out completely. Iowa is no longer the first state for the Democrats. For the Republicans, they're still going to have the Iowa caucuses first. But for the Democrats, who knows when Iowa gets to vote? It's way down the line. Iowa's no longer relevant. That's the message here. So who replaces Iowa? And Iowa would have been a state very, very sympathetic, I think, to RFK Jr. I think that Joe Biden has never once won an Iowa caucus, which I think is the main reason why Iowa got booted, because they routinely vote against Joe Biden. They reject him every single time he has run for president. Joe Biden has never done well in Iowa, and so since he is running for re-election this this coming cycle, the Democratic Party could not allow Iowa to embarrass him once again. And so instead they picked loyal and controlled South Carolina, a state where the Democratic Party is a machine, where the voters in Democratic primaries, let's be honest, just like in Republican primaries, don't express a lot of agency. The idea here is that South Carolina is going to be able to deliver Joe Biden a win. If Joe Biden holds on in the very first state of the primary cycle, that is going to take the wind out of the sails of any potential challenger. And so South Carolina is essentially going to be a fortress for Joe Biden. And so any challenger, whether it's RFK or anybody else, is going to have to weigh this. Is it worth trying to fight it out in South Carolina, knowing that Joe Biden is at such a significant advantage? Or are you going to just give up on South Carolina, admit it's a lost cause, and move to the next two states, which come just a couple days later? And those being New Hampshire and Nevada, two states, I think, where RFK Jr. has a much better shot, particularly New Hampshire. I mean, New Hampshire, it comes 2024, and RFK Jr. doesn't win New Hampshire, even if his campaign is not doing well, even if it looks like, hey, RFK Jr. has no shot at winning, if he can at least win New Hampshire, then I don't think anyone will be even paying attention to the Democratic primary. That's how much of a settled thing it'll be. New Hampshire should be, of the early states, the easiest win for RFK Jr. if he's going to be a candidate. And if he only wins New Hampshire out of those first three, I think that would be a problem for him. And I don't think it would be something that he would come back from. Because think about it, Joe Biden lost something like the first four primaries in the 2020 primary to not just Bernie Sanders. I think it was Bernie Sanders and like Mayor Pete or something won one state. And Joe Biden was still considered a front runner, even though he had lost every state up until that point. You know, all the early states went against Joe Biden. Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada. I can't remember what the fourth one was, but I'm pretty sure all four just not having any of that Joe Biden. And yet he still somehow went on to win. And then after all that, the guy who had the weakest so-called primary victory in recent memory won 81 million votes. Imagine that. Anyway, the other state that's voting on the same day as New Hampshire is Nevada. And I'm sorry I've been so scatterbrained today. I mean, we're already 8.5 minutes into this, and I'm only on Nevada. Nevada's a caucus. At least it was in 2020. I assume it will be in 2024 as well. Caucuses tend to favor insurgent candidates with a lot of energy that have dedicated followers, and this should be a good thing for RFK Jr. It was a good thing for Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, I believe, won in Nevada, although they might have stolen it from him. I have trouble remembering because the Democratic Party purposefully did not report results in the states where Joe Biden lost, at first. They were counting the votes for a very long time. And then all of a sudden, a few weeks later, when those states no longer mattered, to the media narrative, it's like, oh yeah, Joe Biden lost those states, by the way. They did that with Iowa. I mean, almost nobody heard that Bernie Sanders won Iowa. I believe it was Bernie. Pretty sure Joe Biden came in at least third or fourth in Iowa. Anyway, Nevada and New Hampshire both should be gettable for Kennedy. If he doesn't get both of them, I would say he's pretty much dead at that point. It's too long of a shot. He needs to build early momentum. And South Carolina, I don't think is going to be a place to do it. Now, maybe you make the case, hey, if he gets wiped out in South Carolina, but knocks out both Nevada and New Hampshire, wins both those states, people will forget about his big loss in South Carolina. So it might be worth just completely sacrificing South Carolina. Then again, if he gets hit too bad in South Carolina, maybe people in Nevada and New Hampshire will think, gee, I mean, this Kennedy guy, he's obviously a loser. He couldn't even break, 20% in South Carolina. Joe Biden just blew him away, won 80% of the vote in South Carolina. We don't want to vote for a loser, and we're not even going to bother going out and caucusing for him. And so you do have to weigh that a little bit. Now, the third state, oddly enough, is Georgia, another state that should be seen as very loyal, I would think, to Joe Biden. It is another southern state, a southern state that's turning blue, but a southern state nonetheless, and something that I didn't mention when it came to South Carolina. The Democrats in South Carolina pretty much are all black people. In Georgia, the Democrats are black people plus, white liberal transplants, the wine moms. I don't quite understand, considering that Joe Biden was the guy who said that black people ain't black. But, I guess there was a grain of truth to that. Joe Biden told young black men, hey, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. Well, that pretty much seems to be true, because almost every black person voted for Joe Biden in the primary and the general. And so he might have been onto something with that. And they might respond well to that. I don't know why they would respond well to that. If some, let's say, a Mexican child got on the internet in front of a green screen and claimed to be, the Mexican child leader of the white race and said, if you don't support me and follow my lead, you ain't white. Personally, I wouldn't respond really well to that. I wouldn't take that kind of a person seriously. But when Joe Biden comes out and says, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black, I guess black people respect the hustle and the honesty, and so they do just that, and they say, you know what, I am black, so I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. But that's not necessarily a sure thing. I think that RFK Jr. has a much better chance at winning some of the black vote than Bernie Sanders did. Bernie Sanders, I mean, it was obvious from day one. This guy is going to have no institutional support from the black political machines in these states. The James Clyburns of the world. They're not going to help Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders doesn't have any natural appeal to black voters because of just who he is personally. Joe Biden had the support of all the institutional black leaders, in the various areas. And, so people were told at their churches, hey, you got to go vote in the primary for Joe Biden. And they thought, okay, I guess I don't want to be considered not black. I'll go vote for Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders didn't have that going for him. The only people who would vote for Bernie Sanders are people who genuinely liked him. And he wasn't a very genuinely likable guy for most black people. They just didn't respond well to his message. RFK Jr., on the other hand, has a very different style. He is more in the style of his father and his uncle. His uncle, of course, being John F. Kennedy. And those two tended to fare well with po folks of all races. Remember, the gentry back in those days, in the 60s, were Anglo-Saxon or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the WASPs. And the Kennedys, they were Catholics. And so who were the Catholics? The Catholics were the Irish and Italian working class people. And lumped in with that, in the same social standing in a lot of cases. Remember, we had segregation that applied to the Irish as well as the blacks. Black people had, some camaraderie with the Irish folks of those days. Now, these days, I don't think that anyone looks at RFK Jr. like he is a different ethnicity than the ruling class. I don't think that he has that same racial identity. He doesn't come across as a minority in the way that his father and to some extent I would still think his uncle did as well. And so I think he's going to have an implicitly more difficult time trying to make inroads with those communities, but he does have that name, and people, even who weren't alive then, do remember the Kennedy name. So he has a lot going for him. So I don't want to say that it's impossible for him in South Carolina. Because if he has a really strong showing there, let's say he only loses by 10 points. Let's say it's like 60-40, and then he wins Nevada and New Hampshire. Joe Biden, I think, is in big trouble at that point. Because if RFK Jr. is able to hold his own in South Carolina, win Nevada and New Hampshire, he has momentum going into Georgia. Because even though Georgia is more like South Carolina than it is those other two states, he will have the air of a winner behind him. He will have that kind of momentum, and people will think, hey, this Kennedy guy is a serious candidate. And you know what? This crusty Joe Biden guy, even though Kennedy is really old too, maybe it wouldn't be so bad to have someone different than Joe Biden. And this guy's a viable candidate. Look, he's won more states than the sitting president has. And so that could push the voters of Georgia to vote less in line with their neighbors in South Carolina, and more in line with a deep white state like New Hampshire, or a white and Hispanic state like Nevada. And I think that RFK plays well in Nevada and New Hampshire for different reasons. In New Hampshire, it's because he's right next to his home, the Kennedy home of Massachusetts, the Kennedy name. There's a lot of former Massachusetts residents in New Hampshire. And if you think about it, Joe Biden's core demographic, the geriatrics, are the same people who remember the Kennedy family fondly, who were alive during those days. And for that reason, RFK Jr., I think, would have a decent job making inroads with older voters. And like I said, culturally, the folks in New Hampshire and him, I would think that they would mesh very well. I think that his style would play well in the retail politics of New Hampshire. He would sort of be a hometown hero in that case. Not to mention, New Hampshire has a bit of a rebellious spirit. Nevada, on the other hand, he would have to channel his father's old working class appeal. He would need to make inroads with the union vote, which certainly will be organized at the union leadership level to support Joe Biden in the primary. And so RFK would have to directly appeal to union voters, or to union members. And I think he certainly is more able to connect with those kinds of people than Joe Biden ever could. And so in each state, I think we're going to continue to see a pattern of Joe Biden benefiting from the institutional support from the Democratic establishment and its whole hierarchy, while RFK is going to have to make a very personal appeal to the voters, and is not going to be able to rely on the existing social organizations. However, because he's the insurgent candidate and will have the ability to build a network in a place like Nevada, I do think that he benefits on net from it being a caucus, because he has the opportunity to out-organize Joe Biden, because the enthusiasm gap matters a lot more for caucuses than it does for primaries. And so even if Joe Biden does have this great organization in place, because all the unions mobilized to support him, the enthusiasm from the RFK supporters could be enough to make the difference, because if you've got all of the great organization in the world and nobody really, wants to be a part of those organizations, nobody wants to utilize your networks because they just don't care about voting for you, you're still not going to win. As I said, I should have double-checked, but I'm pretty sure old Bernie pulled out a win in Nevada, a decent win if I remember correctly, and I guarantee you the union leadership would have been behind Joe Biden all the way, but they could not compel the union members, even though they had all of that built-in advantage, they could not force the union members to actually go and caucus for Joe Biden. So the final primary in February, which is the first month of the 2024 presidential primary cycle, the last state on February 29th, I think, to vote will be Michigan. And Michigan, I think, that's going to be another tough one, I think, for RFK. And it's because of the governor there. I think there's no doubt that the governor, Gretchen Whitmer, who is essentially the president of your homeowners association. I tell you that, you don't need to really know anything more about her. You can predict everything about, from how she looks to how she talks, to what she believes and how she acts. She is the president of the homeowners association through and through. But for whatever reason, that plays well in Michigan. I guess they're just a state of Karens. And with her support, with her campaigning for Joe Biden in the primary, I think it'll be very tough for RFK to overcome that. These other states don't really have super popular Democratic statewide leaders. You know, what is Jim Clyburn even in the House anymore? I don't think he is. I think Jim Clyburn himself is retired. But even still, he was a congressman. He was not a statewide official in South Carolina. And the same thing with these other 4 states. You know, you don't really have really, popular Democratic statewide politicians who can come in and campaign with a presidential candidate and really elevate them. You know, these people will want to campaign with Joe Biden in these other states because Joe Biden will elevate them, not the other way around. So right now, if RFK puts up a real fight, I could see the first 5 states, this first month, February, going something like this. Joe Biden comes away with a win in South Carolina, but he doesn't win by as much as was anticipated in the polls. RFK does better than expected, still loses. And so let's say he keeps it inside of 20 points. Let's say it's 55-45, something like that, or 57-43. Joe Biden's in the 50s, RFK's in the 40s. Then rolls around New Hampshire and Nevada, and RFK wins. Let's say he was poised to win New Hampshire all along. He was expected to win New Hampshire, and people were thinking, oh, he's going to win New Hampshire and he'll be a one-state wonder, and then his campaign will flame out. Sure, lots of candidates can be competitive in New Hampshire. Look at John Kasich. He came in second in New Hampshire and then lost every other state except for his home state of Ohio. So even a nobody, can do well in New Hampshire if they just sit there and they camp out all the time and they spend all their time and energy in this little tiny state. They can make an impact there, but they won't make a difference anywhere else. So let's say so nobody's really, everyone expects him to win New Hampshire, by like maybe 5 to 10 points. But that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. They've already moved past that, essentially. So when he wins, it's a foregone conclusion. The media won't even care. It won't be a surprise. There will be no headlines the next day, oh, wow, RFK Jr. won a state. They won't care. They've already priced that into the equation. But then he wins Nevada, too, unsurprisingly. Joe Biden was supposed to be the one anticipated to win Nevada by 5 to 10 points, and instead RFK wins it by less than 5, let's say but between 0 and 3, maybe 0.5% to 3%. So he wins, but not by a lot. But it's an unexpected win in Nevada. Then RFK is actually in the game. And from there, I think he needs to win Georgia. Has to really win Georgia. And there's a decent gap there between the New Hampshire and Nevada primaries and then the Georgia primary. There's a week or two, a couple weeks, I think. Maybe a week and a half, something like that. RFK is to go to Georgia, camp out, and he might win it by a hair. And that's a state that he should not win, that he's not particularly well suited for. But he's able to pull out a win anyway. So he's got two upsets, Nevada and Georgia, under his belt, and a win in New Hampshire, which was expected. Joe Biden, all he's got so far is South Carolina, and it wasn't even by as much as he was supposed to win. Then we move to Michigan. At this point, I think if RFK wins Michigan, it will take serious interference to keep him from becoming the Democratic presidential nominee. But that's not my base case. My base case would be, even if he wins those 3 states that I mentioned, I think he still loses Michigan. But again, like South Carolina, if he's able to be competitive, he can stay in the race, hold out for more favorable states, and he could make a comeback as long as, let's say he keeps things close in Michigan. He's still beaten Biden by, 3-2 in terms of number of states. Of course, delegates are different, but that only matters at the end. At this point, perception is what matters. He needs to have some momentum. And then whatever the next state is after Michigan, which I couldn't find nailed down on a calendar, he needs to absolutely win that and then just start knocking them out of the park. So that, to me, is RFK's path in the Democratic nomination. It's possible, but at this point, I'm not going to get my hopes up too high. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.